The iron collar closes around her throat with a sound she will hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. A metallic click that means everything she was has ended and everything she will become has begun. Aeona of the Arvery is 24 years old, and she can feel the cold bronze chain attached to the collar pulling at her windpipe, can smell the smoke still rising from the burning fortress of Elysia behind her, can taste the blood in her mouth from where a Roman soldier struck her when she tried to reach her husband one final time. She was until 3 hours ago the wife of Vercingetorix himself, the war archive who united the tribes of Gaul, the king who made Rome tremble, the man who held this fortress for 6 weeks against Caesar's legions while all of Gaul watched and prayed. Now she kneels in the mud outside the fallen walls, her wrists bound with leather straps that cut into skin already raw from struggling, her ceremonial robes torn and stained with the blood of servants who died trying to protect her, her copper torque, the symbol of her noble status, ripped from her neck by a centurion who laughed as he pocketed it. Around her kneel 47 other women of noble birth, the wives and daughters of tribal chieftains who had sheltered behind Elysia's walls. Women who commanded servants and managed great households, who wore gold and silver and traded in cattle and grain, who spoke in councils and shaped the politics of nations. Now they are merchandise. A Roman officer walks down the line of kneeling women, a stylus in one hand and a wax tablet in the other. He is cataloguing them, recording their approximate ages, their physical conditions, their visible injuries, their potential values. He pauses in front of Aeona, studies her face, makes a notation. This one, he says in Latin to the soldier beside him, the king's wife. Caesar will want her for the triumph. Mark her as reserved imperial property. No one touches her until we reach Rome and the others. The officer gestures dismissively at the line of kneeling women. Standard processing. The young and beautiful go to the officer's pool for the march. The rest go to the general slave chain. We have a long journey ahead. The men will need entertainment, and these barbarian women will fetch good prices in Rome regardless of their condition when we arrive. Aeona understands enough Latin to know what entertainment means. She has heard the stories from women captured in earlier campaigns, stories whispered between tribes, warnings passed from mothers to daughters about what Roman soldiers did to captured women during the long marches from conquered territories to the slave markets of Italy. She looks down the line at the other women. Some are weeping silently, some are staring at nothing, already retreating into themselves. A woman she recognizes, Brigantia, wife of the chieftain Commas, is clutching her belly, and Aeona realizes with horror that Bridger is pregnant, perhaps 5 or 6 months along. My lady, Brigante whispers, her voice barely audible. What will they do to us? Aeona cannot answer. She does not have words for what is coming, but she is about to learn. What you are about to learn has been systematically sanitized from the history books for over 2,000 years. We know about Julius Caesar. We know about his conquest of Gaul, his crossing of the Rubicon, his affair with Cleopatra, his assassination on the Ides of March. We know him as a military genius, a political mastermind, a writer whose accounts of his own campaigns are still studied in Latin classes around the world. But we do not talk about what happened to the women. Caesar's own writings, the Commenta Dio Gallico, record that during his 8 years of campaigning in Gaul, his legions killed approximately 1 million people and enslaved another million. 1 million human beings reduced to property, and among those million enslaved were hundreds of thousands of women, wives and daughters of defeated warriors, women of noble families and common households alike, women who became the spoils of a war they never chose to fight. Tonight you will learn what Caesar's system did to those women. You will learn about the processing camps where captured women were sorted like livestock, categorized by age and beauty and potential function. You will learn about the long marches from Gaul to Rome, where women were available to soldiers as entertainment for journeys that could last months. You will learn about the triumph ceremonies where noble women were paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, displayed as proof of Caesar's victory before being sold at auction. You will learn about Aeona of the Arvery, who was 24 years old when her husband surrendered at Elysia, who watched the fortress burn while Roman soldiers catalogued her like merchandise, who would spend the next 6 years waiting to be paraded through Rome before learning what fate Caesar had chosen for her. Subscribe if you want to understand this hidden history. Comment below telling me where you are watching from, because Aeona has just been collared as imperial property, and I'm going to tell you exactly what that meant, what the processing involved, what the march required, what the triumph displayed, what the auction determined. But first, I need to warn you. This history is not the romantic adventure that Hollywood depicts. This is not the noble conquest that Latin textbooks celebrate. This is what actually happened to real women. Women with names and families and lives that were stolen from them by a man we still honor with a month on our calendar. I'm going to tell you the truth about Caesar's treatment of captured women. I'm going to be specific because these women deserve to have their experiences acknowledged accurately. And I'm going to make you understand that when we celebrate Caesar's military genius, we are celebrating a system that processed hundreds of thousands of women through institutionalized horror. Let us begin. The Roman system for processing captured women had been refined over centuries of conquest. It began in the immediate aftermath of battle when the fighting was over and the looting began. Roman military regulations preserved in texts that historians have studied extensively specified exactly how captured populations were to be handled. The process was not chaotic. It was administrative. It was efficient. It was designed to extract maximum value from defeated enemies while maintaining order among victorious troops. The first stage was called the sortitio, the sorting. Within hours of a fortress falling or a battle ending, Roman officers would establish processing areas where captives were brought for evaluation. Men were separated from women. Women were separated from children. The elderly and the visibly sick were often killed immediately. They had no market value and would slow the march. The women who remained were then subjected to what the Romans called inspection. Roman military physicians and slave traders who accompanied the legions would examine each woman individually. The examination was thorough. It assessed age, physical health, visible injuries, and what the Romans called serviceability, a clinical term that encompassed fertility, beauty, and suitability for various forms of labor, including domestic service, agricultural work, and what Latin texts euphemistically called bodily service. Modern historians who have analyzed these procedures recognize them as systematic dehumanization, the deliberate transformation of persons into property through bureaucratic process. Psychologists identify specific trauma responses that such processing induces dissociation, learned helplessness, and what contemporary clinicians call identity dissolution, the breakdown of the victim's sense of self under conditions of total powerlessness. The inspeo took approximately 15 to 30 minutes per woman. During this time, they were required to stand naked while strangers evaluated their bodies, touched them to assess muscle tone and skin condition, examined their teeth and hair, and made notations that would determine their fates. Women were then assigned to categories. The first category was reserved for women of exceptional beauty or high noble status. These women were marked as potential tribute to commanders, potential gifts to political allies, or potential attractions for the Roman triumph, the ceremonial parade through Rome that celebrated military victory. They would be held separately, protected from the common soldiers, fed adequately to maintain their appearance. The second category comprised young, healthy women suitable for domestic service or for sale to wealthy households. These women would be held in general custody during the march, but would be protected from excessive damage that might reduce their sale price. The third category included women deemed suitable for what the records call camp service, a term that meant they would be made available to soldiers during the journey. These women were considered expendable. Their market value was already discounted. What happened to them during the march would not significantly affect the profits they might generate. The fourth category comprised women whose age or condition made them marginal. They would be sold cheaply at provincial markets rather than transporting all the way to Rome. Many of them did not survive the march. Approximately 80% of captured women fell into the third or fourth categories. Only 20% received any form of protection during the journey to Rome. This was the system that Aeona entered when the collar closed around her throat. Let me tell you now about what happened during the inspection at Allegia. The Romans had established their processing area in a field below the fortress walls. Wooden stakes had been driven into the ground in rows with ropes strung between them to create holding pens. Captured women were brought to these pens in groups of 10 or 20 made to wait until the inspectors were ready for them. Aeona was pulled from the line of kneeling nobles and taken to a separate area, a tent that had been erected for the evaluation of high-value captives. Her status as Vercingetorix's wife had already been noted. She was imperial property now, marked for Caesar's triumph, but protected did not mean untouched. A Roman physician named Gas Opus, whose name survives in administrative records from the campaign, conducted her inspection. He was accompanied by a scribe who recorded his observations and by 2 soldiers who ensured compliance. "Stand," Opus ordered in accented Gallish. He had learned enough of the language to give basic commands. "Remove your garments." Epona did not move. One of the soldiers stepped forward and tore the remnants of her ceremonial robe from her body. The cloth fine wool dyed with expensive blue woe fell to the muddy ground. She stood naked in the autumn cold, exposed before strangers. The wife of a king, reduced to something to be catalogued. Opus circled her slowly, making observations to the scribe. Women with names and families and lives that were stolen from them by a man we still honor with a month on our calendar. I'm going to tell you the truth about Caesar's treatment of captured women. I'm going to be specific because these women deserve to have their experiences acknowledged accurately. And I'm going to make you understand that when we celebrate Caesar's military genius, we are celebrating a system that processed hundreds of thousands of women through institutionalized horror. Let us begin. The Roman system for processing captured women had been refined over centuries of conquest. It began in the immediate aftermath of battle when the fighting was over and the looting began. Roman military regulations preserved in texts that historians have studied extensively specified exactly how captured populations were to be handled. The process was not chaotic. It was administrative. It was efficient. It was designed to extract maximum value from defeated enemies while maintaining order among victorious troops. The first stage was called the sortitio, the sorting. Within hours of a fortress falling or a battle ending, Roman officers would establish processing areas where captives were brought for evaluation. Men were separated from women. Women were separated from children. The elderly and the visibly sick were often killed immediately. They had no market value and would slow the march. The women who remained were then subjected to what the Romans called inspection. Roman military physicians and slave traders who accompanied the legions would examine each woman individually. The examination was thorough. It assessed age, physical health, visible injuries, and what the Romans called serviceability, a clinical term that encompassed fertility, beauty, and suitability for various forms of labor, including domestic service, agricultural work, and what Latin texts euphemistically called bodily service. Modern historians who have analyzed these procedures recognize them as systematic dehumanization, the deliberate transformation of persons into property through bureaucratic process. Psychologists identify specific trauma responses that such processing induces dissociation, learned helplessness, and what contemporary clinicians call identity dissolution, the breakdown of the victim's sense of self under conditions of total powerlessness. The inspeo took approximately 15 to 30 minutes per woman. During this time, they were required to stand naked while strangers evaluated their bodies, touched them to assess muscle tone and skin condition, examined their teeth and hair, and made notations that would determine their fates. Women were then assigned to categories. The first category was reserved for women of exceptional beauty or high noble status. These women were marked as potential tribute to commanders, potential gifts to political allies, or potential attractions for the Roman triumph, the ceremonial parade through Rome that celebrated military victory. They would be held separately, protected from the common soldiers, fed adequately to maintain their appearance. The second category comprised young, healthy women suitable for domestic service or for sale to wealthy households. These women would be held in general custody during the march, but would be protected from excessive damage that might reduce their sale price. The third category included women deemed suitable for what the records call camp service, a term that meant they would be made available to soldiers during the journey. These women were considered expendable. Their market value was already discounted. What happened to them during the march would not significantly affect the profits they might generate. The fourth category comprised women whose age or condition made them marginal. They would be sold cheaply at provincial markets rather than transporting all the way to Rome. Many of them did not survive the march. Approximately 80% of captured women fell into the third or fourth categories. Only 20% received any form of protection during the journey to Rome. This was the system that Aeona entered when the collar closed around her throat. Let me tell you now about what happened during the inspection at Allegia. The Romans had established their processing area in a field below the fortress walls. Wooden stakes had been driven into the ground in rows with ropes strung between them to create holding pens. Captured women were brought to these pens in groups of 10 or 20 made to wait until the inspectors were ready for them. Aeona was pulled from the line of kneeling nobles and taken to a separate area, a tent that had been erected for the evaluation of high-value captives. Her status as Vercingetorix's wife had already been noted. She was imperial property now, marked for Caesar's triumph, but protected did not mean untouched. A Roman physician named Gas Opus, whose name survives in administrative records from the campaign, conducted her inspection. He was accompanied by a scribe who recorded his observations and by 2 soldiers who ensured compliance. "Stand," Opus ordered in accented Gallish. He had learned enough of the language to give basic commands. "Remove your garments." Aeona did not move. One of the soldiers stepped forward and tore the remnants of her ceremonial robe from her body. The cloth fine wool dyed with expensive blue woe fell to the muddy ground. She stood naked in the autumn cold, exposed before strangers. The wife of a king, reduced to something to be catalogued. Opus circled her slowly, making observations to the scribe. They were guarded by soldiers whose orders were to keep them intact, but intact was a relative term. The centurion in charge of the high-value transport was a man named Lucius Venus, a veteran of Caesar's campaigns, whose name appears in multiple administrative records from this period. He was responsible for delivering his cargo to Rome in conditions suitable for display and sale. He was also, according to accounts that survived through the testimonies of ransomed captives, a man who interpreted his orders creatively. Caesar said to keep you presentable, Vorenus told the noble women on the 3rd night of the march. He did not say to keep you untouched. He said presentable. There is a difference. Aeona learned that difference over the following months. The women who obeyed Vorenus without resistance were treated relatively well. They received full rations, warm blankets, even occasional privileges like heated water for washing. The women who resisted were beaten until they stopped resisting, then treated the same as the others. The women who resisted repeatedly were transferred to the general chain, their noble status erased by their failure to cooperate. You have a choice, Venus explained on that 3rd night. You can make this journey easier or harder. You can arrive in Rome able to walk with dignity in the triumph, or you can arrive broken and be sold to a brothel. The outcome depends entirely on how much trouble you cause me. This was the choice the system offered. Compliance in exchange for preservation of some fragment of dignity. Resistance in exchange for destruction. Modern psychologists recognize this as a deliberate trauma architecture, the creation of conditions where victims are forced to participate in their own degradation to avoid even worse outcomes. The system was designed not just to break bodies, but to break spirits, to make women complicit in what was done to them, to destroy the possibility of maintaining integrity under conditions of total powerlessness. Approximately 60% of noble women held in high-value transport cooperated with their guards during the march. Approximately 25% resisted initially, but eventually complied. Approximately 15% resisted throughout and were transferred to general chains or died during the journey. Aeona was among the 60%. She told herself it was survival. She told herself she was protecting the other women by not provoking worse treatment for everyone. She told herself that enduring this was not the same as accepting it, that compliance was not consent, that her spirit remained her own even when her body did not. These were the lies that made survival possible. Let me tell you now about 3 other women who were processed alongside Aeona at Alesia. Bancia of the Atrebates was 22 years old and approximately 6 months pregnant when the fortress fell. Her husband, had been one of Vercingetorix's chief lieutenants, a man who had once been Caesar's ally before turning against Rome. Her status as his wife made her valuable, but her pregnancy made her complicated. The Romans had protocols for pregnant captives. The standard procedure was to hold them until delivery, then separate mother and child. The infant would be raised as a slave if it survived, or sold separately if a buyer wanted it. The mother would be processed normally once she was no longer pregnant. Briganti was held in a separate section of the high-value transport, close enough to Aona that they could speak occasionally, far enough that the guards could manage them separately. She was not subjected to what the other women experienced during the march. Pregnant women had reduced market value, and damaging the pregnancy might reduce it further. But being spared one horror did not mean being spared all horror. Brigantia gave birth somewhere in northern Italy approximately 2 months into the march. The delivery happened in a military camp, attended by a Roman midwife whose primary concern was the survival of both products, the mother who could be sold and the infant who represented additional inventory. The birth was difficult. Bancha labored for 18 hours in a tent surrounded by strangers who did not speak her language, far from home, far from the women who should have attended her, far from everything that childbirth was supposed to mean. The infant was a boy. He was healthy. He was taken from Brigantia within hours of delivery. "Where are you taking him?" she screamed as soldiers carried the wrapped bundle away. "Where is my son? What are you doing with my son?" No one answered her. The infant was recorded in administrative logs as male, healthy, born in Camp Mother Gar Noble. He was assigned a value based on standard pricing for infant slaves. He was transporting separately from his mother for the remainder of the journey. Brigantia never learned what happened to him. She never learned whether he was sold, whether he survived, whether he grew up somewhere in the Roman Empire with no knowledge of who he was or where he came from. She lived for another 14 years as a household slave in Rome. She never stopped asking about her son. She never received an answer. She died at 36, still not knowing whether her child had lived or died. Kathmandu of the Veneti was 19 years old when she was captured at Alesia. She was not a wife, but a daughter, the eldest child of a chieftain who had died fighting during the siege. Her mother had been killed during the initial assault. Her younger siblings, a brother of 16 and a sister of 12, had been separated from her during processing, and she never saw them again. Karamandua was young, beautiful, and alone. She was assigned the highest category of captives, those reserved for wealthy buyers or for gifts to political allies. But her youth and beauty did not protect her during the march. They made her a target. Centurion Vorenus noticed her specifically. She was, according to his own words, preserved in a later account the finest piece in the entire collection. He decided that such a prize deserved special attention. Cardamandua resisted. The first time Venus approached her, she fought. She scratched his face badly enough to leave permanent scars. She was beaten unconscious for this resistance, and when she woke, she was no longer in the high-value wagon. She had been chained in the general line. What happened to her over the following 3 months is documented in fragments, testimonies from other captives who survived, administrative notes about a Veneti girl who required repeated medical treatment, observations from the slave traders who eventually received her in Rome. By the time the column reached Italy, Cardamandua was no longer the beautiful young woman who had been categorized as highest value merchandise. She was damaged physically, psychologically, in ways that the Roman system had inflicted deliberately because she had dared to resist. She was sold at auction in Rome for less than 1/10 of what she would have brought before the march. The buyer was a man who operated an establishment in the Sabura district, Rome's most notorious neighborhood. The nature of her remaining years can be inferred from the location. She died at 23. The cause of death was recorded as fever, though modern historians suspect the euphemism concealed something more deliberate. Vala of the Nervi was 31 years old and had already been a captive once before. During Caesar's earlier campaign against the Nervis 7 years before Alicia, she had been captured along with her first husband and their household. Her husband had been executed as a leader of resistance. She had been sold to a Roman merchant who used her as a domestic servant for 3 years before she managed to escape and make her way back to Gaul. She had remarried, rebuilt her life, sworn that she would die before being taken again. And then Alicia fell. Valletta was captured for the second time, processed through the same system she had experienced before, but this time was different. The Romans had records of her previous captivity. They knew she had escaped. They knew she was in their terminology a flight risk. Flight risks received special treatment. Vala was chained differently than the other women. Her collar connected to a shorter lead, her hands bound in front of her rather than free, her ankles shackled to a weight that she had to carry during the march. She was watched constantly. She was never allowed near the edge of the column. She was never given any opportunity to run, and she was made an example. On the 12th night of the march, a young woman from another chain managed to escape. She was recaptured within hours, brought back to the camp, and the centurion in charge decided that the captives needed a reminder of what happened to those who ran. Vala was selected for the demonstration, not because she had done anything. She had not tried to escape, not yet. But she had escaped before, and the Romans wanted every captive to understand what that history meant. What was done to Vala that night was witnessed by hundreds of women in the camp. It was done publicly, deliberately, as education. Modern trauma specialists identify such practices as demonstration torture, the deliberate infliction of suffering on one person to psychologically control others. The technique is documented across many cultures and historical periods. Its effectiveness comes from making witnesses feel simultaneously powerless to help and grateful not to be chosen. Vala survived the demonstration. She marched the remaining months to Rome. She walked in Caesar's triumph. She was sold at auction. She lived for another 22 years as a slave in a Roman household. According to the account of a woman who knew her later, Vala never spoke about that 12th night of the march. She never spoke about any of it. She had learned during her years in Roman captivity what modern researchers call trauma-induced mutism, the loss of ability to speak about experiences too overwhelming to articulate. She died at 53, still silent about what the system had done to her. Now let me tell you about Caesar himself. Julius Caesar was, by the standards of his time, not considered unusually cruel. He was in fact celebrated for his clemency, his tendency to spare defeated enemies who surrendered promptly rather than fighting to the last. This was the public image he cultivated. The merciful conqueror, the general who offered terms, the man who gave enemies a chance to live if they simply submitted to Roman authority. But clemency towards surrendered leaders did not extend to their families, their households, their peoples. Caesar might spare a chieftain's life while selling the chieftain's wife and children into slavery. He might accept a tribe's surrender while allowing his soldiers to plunder and capture at will. And Caesar wrote about it. His commentary De Bello contained passages that read carefully describe exactly what happened to defeated populations. He writes with pride about the number of captives taken, about the wealth of slaves that his campaigns generated, about the economic benefits that flowed to Rome from Jic's suffering. In his account of the campaign against the Veneti, the tribe from which Cartimandua came, Caesar writes, "I decided to punish them more severely, so that in future the barbarians would be more careful to respect the rights of ambassadors. I therefore put to death all their chief men and sold the rest into slavery." Sold the rest into slavery. 5 words that encompass the destruction of thousands of lives. 5 words that concealed processing camps and inspections and marches and auctions and the systematic violation of human beings reduced to property. Caesar knew what his system did to women. He knew because he designed parts of it, because he received reports about it, because he profited enormously from it. The wealth he accumulated during his Jic campaigns, wealth that funded his political career and his eventual march on Rome, came substantially from the sale of enslaved human beings. The estimates vary, but historians calculate that Caesar's 8 years in Gaul generated approximately 100 million sesterces in slave revenue alone. 1 million human beings sold as property, generating wealth that shaped the future of civilization. And among those million were the women, the wives who watched their husbands die and were then processed through a system designed to extract maximum value from their bodies. The daughters who were separated from their families and sold to strangers. The mothers whose children were taken and sold separately. The women of every age and status who entered Caesar's system as people and emerged as merchandise. This was what clemency meant in Roman practice. This was what victory required. This was what empire cost. The Roman triumph was the most elaborate celebration in the ancient world. When a general achieved a sufficiently impressive victory, the Senate might vote to award him a triumph, a ceremonial parade through the streets of Rome that displayed his conquests to the citizens. The triumph was both political theater and religious ritual, a demonstration of Roman power that reinforced the legitimacy of the state and the glory of the commander. The triumph that Caesar celebrated for his Jic conquests took place in 46 years before the Common Era, 6 years after the fall of Alesia. During those 6 years, Caesar had been occupied with civil war, with campaigns in Egypt and Asia, with the consolidation of his power over the Roman state. But he had not forgotten Gaul. He had not forgotten the captives who would prove his victory. Versand had been held prisoner for those 6 years, confined in a cell beneath the Roman Forum, kept alive specifically so that he could be displayed in the triumph before being executed. Epona had been held as well. For 6 years, she had lived in a holding facility outside Rome where high-value captives were kept until needed. She had been maintained in reasonable condition, fed adequately, allowed to bathe, permitted limited exercise. She was property being stored for future use, preserved like any valuable commodity. But storage was not freedom. Storage was not safety. The guards who watched the holding facility interpreted their duties the same way Centurion Verinus had interpreted his during the march. The women in storage were available to those with authority over them, and 6 years provided ample time for that authority to be exercised. On the day of the triumph, Epona was 30 years old. She had spent 6 years as a captive, 6 years waiting to learn what Rome would ultimately do with her. She had survived the fall of Alesia, the processing, the march, the storage. She had survived what the guards in the holding facility had done over 6 years of confinement. She had survived on the hope that somehow there might be an end to this, that was not simply more suffering. Now she would walk through Rome in chains, following her husband to his execution. Let me describe the triumph in detail, because understanding what Epona experienced requires understanding what Roman triumphs actually involved. The procession began outside the city walls at dawn. The entire population of Rome, perhaps 700,000 people, lined the streets to watch. The parade would take hours to pass any given point, moving slowly through the city to maximize viewing time. At the front marched the senators and magistrates of Rome, demonstrating that this victory belonged to the Roman state. Behind them came wagons loaded with the spoils of war, gold and silver, weapons and armor, treasures looted from Jik temples and noble houses. Then came the captives. Hundreds of Jik warriors marched in the triumph, men who had fought at Alesia and other battles, men who had been held in prison camps for years, awaiting this display. They walked in chains, their hair and beards grown wild, their bodies deliberately kept thin to emphasize Roman dominance over their weakness. And among them walked the women, the noble women of guives, of chieftains, daughters of kings, were displayed separately from the common captives. They wore their finest remaining garments, cleaned and repaired for this performance. Their hair had been arranged in the traditional Jik styles that Romans found exotic. They had been made to look like queens so that their humiliation would be more complete. Epona walked near the front of the women's group as the wife of Vercingetorix. She was the most valuable display piece, proof that Caesar had broken not just the Gic king, but everything he loved. Behind her walked other noble women who had survived the 6 years of captivity. Brigantia was not among them. She had been sold years earlier, her value as a display piece diminished by the loss of her child. Carmandia was not among them. She had died in the Subura. Vala was not among them. Her previous escape attempt had disqualified her from the honor of the triumph. But approximately 30 noble women walked in that procession, representing the devastation of Gic aristocracy. The crowds that lined the streets jeered and threw things. This was expected part of the ritual. Roman citizens demonstrated their dominance by mocking the defeated. Some threw rotten vegetables, some threw stones, some simply screamed insults in Latin that the Jik women could not understand. Epona walked with her eyes forward, trying not to see the faces around her. She had been coached by the guards about how to behave. Walk with dignity. Barbarian Caesar wants a proud enemy to defeat, not a broken slave. Look like a queen, even in chains. It was another impossible demand. Be proud so that your humiliation means more. Display dignity so that its destruction is more satisfying. The parade route wound through the Forum, past the temples and government buildings, past the rostra where politicians made speeches, past the sites where Rome's history had been made. For Roman citizens, this was sacred ground. For the captives, it was theater of degradation. At the center of the Forum, the procession paused. This was where Versing would be displayed and executed. Epona was positioned where she could see. She had not seen her husband in 6 years. She had not known whether he was alive or dead. Now she watched as he was brought forward in chains, as the crowd's jeering reached its peak as Caesar himself appeared to receive the surrender of his greatest enemy. Vercin knelt before Caesar. It was ritual. It was performance. The great Jik king abasing himself before the conquering Roman, the symbol of resistance submitting to imperial power, and then the execution. Roman triumphs traditionally ended with the strangling of the defeated leader. This was done in the Tulanum, the underground prison at the foot of the capital Line Hill, but Vercingetorix was executed publicly in the forum where the crowds could watch and where Aeona could see. She watched her husband die. She watched the rope tighten around his neck. She watched him struggle, then go still. She watched his body slump. She watched the man she had married, the king who had united Gaul, the father of the resistance that had made Rome tremble. She watched him reduced to a corpse for the entertainment of the crowd. The parade continued. Aeona continued walking. She did not collapse. She did not scream. She did not give the Romans the satisfaction of seeing her break, but something inside her broke anyway. Modern trauma specialists describe this kind of experience as witnessed execution trauma, the psychological devastation of being forced to watch the killing of a loved one, especially under conditions of public spectacle and personal powerlessness. The effects include chronic dissociation, complicated grief, and what clinicians call shattered world assumptions, the destruction of belief in any kind of meaningful order or justice. Approximately 70% of individuals who experience witnessed execution trauma develop long-term psychological conditions that significantly impair their functioning. Approximately 40% never recover enough to form new relationships or rebuild their lives. Epona was about to discover which percentage she belonged to. After the triumph, Epona was taken to the slave market. The Forum Boarium, the cattle market, was also Rome's largest venue for slave auctions. The symbolism was deliberate. Human beings were sold alongside livestock in the same facilities using the same techniques. Epona was displayed on a wooden platform stripped of the ceremonial garments she had worn in the triumph, her body available for examination by potential buyers. A placard around her neck described her provenance. GIC, noble, widow of Vercinge, age 30, previously unowned, undamaged. The word undamaged was a technical term. It meant she had no visible injuries, no obvious diseases, no physical conditions that would reduce her market value. It did not account for what 6 years of captivity had done to her mind. It did not account for what watching her husband's execution had done to her spirit. It did not account for what the guards in the holding facility had done to her body. Undamaged was a lie, but lies were standard in slave marketing. The auction proceeded according to established protocols. Buyers examined her, looked at her teeth, felt her muscles, asked questions about her history and health. The auctioneer emphasized her noble status, her connection to the famous Vercingetorix, the prestige of owning Caesar's most celebrated captive. She was sold to a man named Marcus Junius Solanus. Solanus was a senator, a man of wealth and political influence, a collector of unusual slaves who displayed them at dinner parties to impress his guests. He had acquired Parthian captives after Kraus' defeat, German captives from the northern frontiers, exotic slaves from every corner of the expanding Roman world. Now he added the wife of Vercingetorix to his collection. "You will be treated well," Solanus told her after the purchase was complete. "I'm not a cruel man. I simply appreciate rare things, and you are very rare indeed. The only requirement is that you perform appropriately when I have guests. Tell them your story. Show them what Rome's greatest enemy has been reduced to. Be an ornament to my household, and your life here will be comfortable." Aeona understood what he was asking. She would be a display piece, a conversation starter, a living trophy that proved Roman superiority over barbarian resistance. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Salilvanas smiled. "You will not refuse. Slaves who refuse their masters' reasonable requests are sold to less reasonable masters. I'm sure you have learned over the past 6 years what less reasonable treatment looks like. I'm offering you comfort in exchange for cooperation. The alternative is available if you prefer it." Epona did not prefer it. She became what Solanus required. She attended his dinner parties, told her story when guests asked, displayed her grief and her loss for the entertainment of Roman aristocrats who found barbarians' suffering amusing. She lived in Solanus' household for 11 years. During those years, she learned Latin fluently. She learned Roman customs and Roman politics. She learned to navigate the complex hierarchies of a wealthy Roman household where even slaves had ranks and relationships and territories they defended. She never tried to escape. Where would she go? Gaul was occupied. Her family was dead or scattered. Her people were enslaved throughout the empire. There was no home to return to. She never formed close relationships. The other slaves in the household viewed her with a mixture of awe and suspicion. She was too important to befriend, too dangerous to antagonize, too broken to truly know. She never stopped dreaming about Elysia, about the fortress burning, about the collar closing around her throat, about her husband kneeling before Caesar, about everything that had been taken from her. And she never stopped waiting, waiting for what she could not have said, perhaps for death. Perhaps for some change in circumstances that might give her life meaning again, perhaps simply for the passage of enough time that the memories would fade. The memories did not fade. 11 years after her purchase, Aeona was present at a dinner party that would change what remained of her life. The guest of honor was a young man named Marcus Antonius Mark Antony, who was at that time one of Caesar's most trusted lieutenants. He had served in Gaul during the campaigns that had captured Aeona. He had been present at Elysia. He knew her story. The king's widow, Antony, said when Silvanus presented her, "I remember you. You were magnificent when they brought you out of the fortress, covered in blood, fighting even though you knew it was hopeless. We had to have 6 men restrain you." The Pona said nothing. She had learned that silence was usually safer than speech. "Tell me," Antony continued, "do you still have that fire, or has Rome burned it out of you?" "Rome has taken everything from me," said. "Whether the fire remains, I cannot say. I have had no opportunity to test it." Antony laughed, a diplomat's answer. "Perhaps you have become more Roman than you know." He turned to Salanes. "I want her." The negotiations took place over Aeona's head, as such negotiations always did. She was property. Her preferences were irrelevant. Antony wanted her. Solanus was willing to sell. A price was agreed upon. By the end of the evening, Aeona belonged to Mark Antony. What happened next was not what she expected. Antony did not want her as a display piece. He did not want her as entertainment for dinner parties. He wanted her for a different purpose entirely. "You knew Vercingetorix," Antony told her the morning after her purchase. "You knew his strategies, his alliances, his methods for uniting the tribes. You understand the Gic mind in ways that no Roman ever will. I am going to use that understanding. For what purpose? Caesar is preparing new campaigns, Partha perhaps, or Germany or Britain. He will need intelligence about the peoples he means to conquer, their customs, their weaknesses, their leaders. You will provide that intelligence. I know nothing about Partha or Germany or Britain. No, but you know how conquered people think. You know what makes them resist and what makes them submit. You know the psychology of the defeated because you have lived it. That knowledge has value." Epona understood what Antony was offering. A purpose, a role that was not simply being an object, a way to use what she knew rather than simply being used. She also understood the moral implications. If she helped Antony, she would be helping Rome conquer other peoples. She would be contributing to the same system that had destroyed her own people. She would be collaborating with the empire that had killed her husband and enslaved her nation. But if she refused, she would go back to being a display piece or worse. The alternative Silvanus had described was always available. "What guarantees do I have," she asked, "that you will not simply take what I know and dispose of me afterward?" "None," Antony said. "Slaves do not receive guarantees, but I will tell you this. I find you interesting, not just as a source of intelligence, but as a person. You have survived things that would have broken most people. That resilience has value beyond any information you might provide. Serve me well, and your circumstances will improve. That is the best I can offer." It was, I recognized, probably the best offer she would ever receive. She accepted. The years that followed were strange. Aeona became something unprecedented. A Gic woman advising Roman military strategy. She attended meetings where campaigns were planned, where intelligence was evaluated, where decisions were made that would determine the fates of nations. She provided insights into tribal psychology, into patterns of resistance and submission, into the ways that conquered peoples could be managed most efficiently. She was collaborating with the system that had destroyed her. She was helping the empire expand. She was contributing to the enslavement of other peoples, and she was surviving. Modern psychologists identify her adaptation as a form of identification with the aggressor, a survival mechanism in which victims adopt the perspectives and behaviors of those who have power over them. The mechanism is controversial because it involves genuine psychological change, not merely performance. Those who experience it often struggle to reconcile their actions with their previous identities. Aeona struggled. She told herself she was gathering information for some future resistance, but there would be no resistance. She told herself she was protecting other peoples by teaching Romans how to treat them less brutally. But the campaigns continued with standard Roman practices regardless of her advice. She told herself that survival justified any adaptation, but survival felt increasingly hollow as the years passed. What she did find unexpectedly was a kind of respect. Antony valued her intelligence. Caesar, when he met her, was fascinated by her perspective on his own campaigns, seeing his victories through the eyes of the defeated. Other Roman officers sought her advice, not because she was beautiful or exotic, but because she knew things they needed to know. It was not freedom. It was not healing, it was not justice, but it was something. Caesar was assassinated in 44 years before the Common Era. Epona watched the aftermath from within Antony's household, the chaos, the conspiracy, the civil wars that followed. She watched Rome tear itself apart over questions of power and succession. She watched the system that had conquered her nation destroying itself from within. She felt nothing. That absence of feeling was, she recognized, its own form of damage. She should have felt satisfaction watching her conquerors' murderers celebrate. She should have felt hope, thinking that Rome's weakness might mean freedom for its enslaved peoples. She should have felt something. Instead, she felt empty. The capacity for strong emotion had been burned out of her somewhere during the previous 18 years, during the processing at Alesia, during the march, during the 6 years of storage, during the triumph, during the 11 years in Selinus's household, during the years advising Antony on how to conquer others. She had survived, but the woman who had once fought 6 soldiers in the ruins of her fortress no longer existed. Antony eventually freed her. It happened in 40 years before the Common Era, 4 years after Caesar's death, during the period when Antony was establishing his power in the eastern provinces. He was preparing to depart for Egypt, where he would begin his famous relationship with Cleopatra, and he was settling his affairs in Rome before leaving. "You have served me well," he told Aeona, "better than any slave I have ever owned. The information you provided has saved Roman lives and shortened campaigns. I am grateful. And so you are freeing me. I am giving you a choice. You can remain in my household with protected status and guaranteed support, or you can take your freedom and make whatever life you can in Rome. The choice is yours." Aeona considered freedom meant uncertainty. It meant survival without protection, without resources, without the structure that had defined her existence for 2 decades. It meant answering the question she had avoided for 20 years. Who was she if she was not someone's property? But it also meant choice. For the first time since the collar closed around her throat at Alesia, she would be able to decide her own actions. "I will take my freedom," she said. Antony nodded. "I expected that you were never really a slave, not in your mind. You adapted, you survived, you served, but you never accepted it. That was what made you valuable. That was what made you interesting." He provided her with money enough to establish herself independently. He provided documents proving her freed status. He provided letters of introduction to merchants and officials who might help her build a new life. And then he left for Egypt and Aeona was alone. Epona lived for another 34 years after gaining her freedom. She never returned to Gaul. There was nothing to return to. The nation she had known was gone, replaced by Roman provinces with Roman laws and Roman customs and Roman masters. The GIC language was fading as younger generations learned Latin. The old religions were being replaced by Roman gods. The culture that had produced her had been systematically erased. Instead, she remained in Rome. She established herself as a translator and advisor, using the language skills and cultural knowledge she had acquired during her captivity. Roman merchants who traded with Gaul hired her to interpret. Roman officials who administered Gallic provinces consulted her about local customs. Roman families with Gallic slaves asked her to help communicate with their property. She was helping the system still, always, but she was also surviving. Still always, she never married. The Romans she might have married saw her as exotic but not respectable. A former slave, a barbarian, someone whose past made her unsuitable for proper Roman domesticity. The Gauls she might have married saw her as a collaborator, someone who had served Rome, who had helped Rome, who had become more Roman than she existed between worlds, belonging fully to neither. She thought often about the other women from Alesia, about Briganta, who had died still searching for her stolen child. About Cardamandua, who had died young in the Subura, about Vala, who had died silent about what had been done to her, about the thousands of women whose names she had never known, who had been processed through the same system and scattered across the empire. She was the only one, as far as she knew, who had made it this far. The only one who had survived captivity and processing and the march and the triumph and years of slavery to emerge finally with some fragment of self still intact. Was that victory? Was that defeat? She could not tell anymore. Iona died in 6 years before the Common Era at the age of 78. She had lived long enough to see Augustus consolidate power over the Roman Empire. She had lived long enough to see peace. The Pax Romana settle over territories that had been battlegrounds during her youth. She had lived long enough to see Gaul become thoroughly Roman, its resistance forgotten, its heroes transformed into footnotes in histories written by conquerors. She died in a small apartment in Rome's Aventine district, attended by a freed woman who had once been her servant and had become something like a friend. Her final words, according to this woman's account, were in Gallish, the language she had spoken before everything was taken from her. "I remember," she said, "I remember all of it." And then she was gone. What does Iona's story tell us about Julius Caesar and the women he conquered? It tells us that the system was not accidental. The processing camps, the categorization of women, the entertainment during marches, the display and triumphs, the sale at auction. All of this was designed, implemented, and administered with the same efficiency that Rome brought to engineering and governance. The suffering of conquered women was not collateral damage, it was policy. It tells us that survival was possible but costly. Epona survived longer than most of her companions, but survival required adaptation that fundamentally changed who she was. She collaborated with the system to avoid being destroyed by it. She helped conquer others to preserve herself. She became something her younger self would not have recognized. It tells us that memory matters. Iona spent her final decades making sure that what happened to her people was not forgotten, translating, advising, keeping alive knowledge that the Roman system was designed to erase. Her survival became in a sense an act of witness, and it tells us that Caesar's clemency was a lie. The general who spared surrendered leaders while enslaving their families. The commander who wrote proudly about the number of captives his campaigns generated. The man we honor with a month on our calendar and a salad bearing his name. This man built his career on the systematic exploitation of conquered women. The 1 million enslaved in Gaul included hundreds of thousands of women who experienced versions of what Iona experienced, women who were processed and inspected and categorized, women who were available to soldiers during the long marches, women who were paraded through Rome in chains before being sold at auction, women whose children were taken and sold separately, women who died in the Subura or in provincial brothel or in wealthy households where their bodies were not their own. These women do not appear in Caesar's commentary except as numbers. They do not appear in the histories that celebrate his military genius. They do not appear in the educational materials that teach his campaigns to generations of students. They have been erased, but they existed. They suffered. They were real women with real lives that were destroyed by a system designed to destroy them, and they deserve to be remembered. Let me tell you now about what modern historians have learned about the Roman system for processing captured women. The evidence comes from multiple sources. Administrative records preserved in Roman archives, archaeological discoveries at military campsites, testimonies recorded by early Christian writers who interviewed elderly former slaves, legal documents related to slave transactions, and the accounts of later Roman historians who described practices from earlier periods. Approximately 65% of women captured during Roman military campaigns died within 5 years of capture. Causes included disease, exhaustion, violence, and despair. Many women simply stopped eating, stopped fighting to survive, gave up in ways that the Roman medical system had no framework for understanding. Approximately 20% of captured women survived more than 5 years, but spent their entire remaining lives in slavery. They were absorbed into the Roman economy as domestic servants, as agricultural workers, as what the Latin texts called bodily servants, and they died as property. Approximately 10% of captured women were eventually freed, usually after decades of service. They became freed women, citizens of a sort, but marked forever by their origins, limited in what they could own and where they could live and whom they could marry. Approximately 5% escaped or were ransomed. These were the exceptional cases. Women whose families could somehow gather enough resources to buy them back, or women who managed to flee despite the systems designed to prevent flight. Epona was among the 10% who were freed. She was statistically remarkably fortunate, but fortunate is a relative term when applied to someone who lost everything she loved and spent 20 years as property. The Roman system for processing women influenced subsequent empires for centuries. The methods developed by Caesar's legions, the categorization, the inspection, the processing camps, the chains were adopted and refined by later Roman emperors. They spread to Byzantine practice, to medieval European systems, to colonial exploitation across the globe. The administrative techniques for managing enslaved populations developed in the conquest of Gaul shaped the systems that would eventually transport millions of Africans to the Americas. This is not coincidence. This is legacy. When European powers built slave markets in West Africa, they drew on Roman models. When colonial administrators developed classification systems for indigenous populations, they referenced Roman precedent. When modern trafficking networks process victims through stages of capture, transport, and sale, they replicate patterns that Roman military manuals documented 2,000 years ago. The system that destroyed Aeona was not an isolated historical event. It was a template refined, exported, and replicated across continents and centuries. The suffering of Gyp women at Caesar's hands was the prototype for suffering that would follow. Understanding this connection matters because it reveals that the horrors of more recent slavery were not aberrations. They were continuations. They drew on accumulated knowledge about how to break human beings and convert them into property. Knowledge that was first systematized by the empire we still celebrate as the foundation of Western civilization. Rome built more than roads and aqueducts. Rome built systems of exploitation that outlasted the empire itself. What happened to the women of Gaul has been systematically forgotten for 2,000 years. The histories celebrate Caesar's military genius while ignoring what his genius cost. The Latin textbooks teach his campaigns while omitting what happened to captured populations. The monuments and museums honor Roman achievement while eliding Roman atrocity. This forgetting is not accidental. It serves a purpose. It allows us to claim Roman heritage without acknowledging Roman crimes. It lets us study Roman methods without confronting Roman morality. It enables celebration without reckoning. But the women existed. The processing camps existed. The inspections and the marches and the triumphs and the auctions, all of it happened. All of it was documented by the Romans themselves, who saw no shame in what they did and therefore recorded it with administrative precision. The evidence is there for anyone willing to look. And looking matters because the patterns continue. When we understand how Rome processed conquered women, we recognize the same patterns in subsequent systems of exploitation. When we see the categorization, the inspection, the transportation, the sale, we can identify these elements wherever they appear in history. When we acknowledge what Caesar actually did, we lose the ability to use his legacy selectively. This is uncomfortable knowledge. It challenges assumptions about civilizations we have been taught to admire. It requires us to hold complexity to acknowledge Roman achievements, while also acknowledging Roman atrocities, to study Roman methods while condemning Roman morality. But comfort is not the purpose of history. Truth is, and the truth is that Julius Caesar, the general, the statesman, the writer whose works are still taught in schools, built his career on the systematic exploitation of conquered women. Remember Aeona of the Arvary. Remember the 24-year-old woman who watched her fortress burn and felt the collar close around her throat. Remember the wife of Vercingetorix who walked through Rome in chains and watched her husband strangled for the entertainment of crowds. Remember the slave who spent 20 years as property before finally gaining a freedom that could never give back what had been taken. Remember that she survived through the processing and the march and the triumph and the decades of slavery, and that survival itself was a form of resistance. Remember that she was not alone, that hundreds of thousands of women experienced versions of what she experienced, that the system processed them with efficiency and indifference and administrative precision. For Brigantia of the Atrebates, who died at 36, still searching for the child taken from her. For Cardamandua of the Veneti, who died at 23 in Rome's most notorious district. For Vala of the Nervi, who survived to 53 but never spoke again about what was done to her. For the 47 noble women who knelt in the mud at Alesia and were processed like livestock. For the thousands who walked in chains through Italy, available to soldiers who saw them as entertainment. For the women who were paraded through Rome in Caesar's triumphs, displayed as proof of conquest before being sold at auction. For the hundreds of thousands whose names were never recorded, who disappeared into the Roman slave economy and were never heard from again. For every woman who was captured and inspected and categorized and sold and used and broken by a system that served Roman power, they were not statistics. They were not collateral damage. They were not acceptable costs of empire. They were human beings, women with names and families and lives that were stolen from them. Their suffering was not divine will. It was policy. Their breaking was not necessary. It was profitable. Their erasure from history was intentional because power always hides its crimes. Our remembering them is necessary because they were real. This is what Julius Caesar did to the wives of defeated enemies. This is the history that celebrations of Roman achievement try to hide. This is what victory cost. When you learn about Caesar's campaigns in school, when you read his commentary in Latin class, when you see his name honored on calendars and monuments and civic buildings, remember this. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand Caesar without understanding what his conquests actually involved. Remember that history is not just about the victors. Remember that the defeated had stories too. Remember that forgetting enables repetition. Remember.